Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diaspora
Conoscere.
Falando.
Diaspora sta de parler.
Diaspora spreekt.
Diasporas speaking.
My name is Rina Limoni and I'm the host of Diaspora Speaking. For this episode, I interviewed Dr. Aidan Hehir about his latest book, Kosovo and the Internationals, Hope, Hubris, and the End of History. In our discussion, we explore how the politics of hope, a central tenet in Aidan's latest book, shaped Kosovo's political trajectory. Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Aidan.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here.
I've been thinking whether to ask you these questions because at the beginning I asked everyone where they're from, where did you grow up, and what do you do in your day-to-day? And I think I'm going to ask you them as well.
I grew up in Limerick, which is in the southwest of Ireland. I was born in 1977, so I grew up in the 1980s in Limerick. Stayed in Limerick till I was about 17 and then left home, moved to Galway, which is another part of Ireland. Yeah, I went to university, did a bit of traveling around, went to Manchester for a weekend in 2000, met my, as she is now, wife and stayed in Manchester and moved back to Limerick and did a PhD and I became an academic then. So I'm a lecturer in international relations. I worked in the University of Limerick for a while, then University of Sheffield, and then I got a job, permanent position at the University of Westminster in London.
I'm curious to know, how did the idea of conducting research on Kosovo develop? How do you choose a country? What triggered your interest?
I was an MA student I started the Masters in 1998, and I was involved in a number of different sort of societies at the university and a political party as well. And then there was the NATO intervention in March 1999. And I don't believe, honestly, I'd ever heard of Kosovo before that. It was the first time I'd ever heard of Kosovo. I'd heard of Yugoslavia, obviously, and I was aware of the conflict in Bosnia. But I think like a lot of people in the West at that time, Kosovo wasn't on the radar. It wasn't something that people discussed in Western Europe. Bosnia had been up to 1995, but there was a kind of a presumption that everything had been resolved. And then this thing in Kosovo erupted. So I got really interested in the idea of the military intervention that NATO launched. My initial interest wasn't so much Kosovo, it was the argument that was put forward, at the time, that NATO's intervention was technically illegal, but that it was the right thing to do, which I thought was an interesting dilemma. NATO's intervention didn't get the authorization of the UN Security Council because of Russia and China, but they went ahead and did it anyway, and it certainly seemed to a lot of people that it was the right thing to do. So you had this clash between law and morality. After I finished the Masters, I went to America for a while and worked over there for a little bit, and I still found that idea fascinating, and I wanted to do a PhD. So my PhD then was about the NATO intervention in 1999. And as I said, I started that PhD not really thinking of Kosovo as being a place that I wanted to study. It was more like a case study. So I read an awful lot about it, and the more I read about it, the more interested I became in Kosovo as its own place rather than just kind of a pawn. A lot of people do PhDs on, Iraq, Kosovo, Bosnia, Afghanistan and stuff like that, but their PhD isn't really about the place. It's about the international reaction to that. And mine was, but I did start to develop a real keen interest in what was happening in Kosovo. That's where it started with NATO's intervention, and I became an academic then. I got a job in Sheffield and I started to do work on state building. And again, Kosovo was the obvious case for me to look at with respect to that. So then I began to look at the post-conflict reconstruction efforts in Kosovo.
And this granting of agency, as you're putting it, reflects well in your research. You published your most recent book, Kosovo and the Internationals, Hope, Hubris, and the End of History, with Palgrave. Congratulations, and thank you for sharing a copy in preparation for this episode. In your research, you highlight how hope as a structural feeling interplays in international politics, taking Kosovo as an example. For our listeners, what does hope mean in international relations?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I had never done any research about hope before I was asked to write an article for a Kosovo magazine called Kosovo 2.0. They were doing their 20th anniversary. They wanted to publish a special issue on hope, and they asked me to write the lead article. This was about 2020 or 2021. And I didn't really think that hope was something that I could write about, because it's not something actually that people in international relations generally talk about very much. Because what does international relations have to say about hope, or what does hope mean in international relations? It's not clear, because there isn't really a body of academic work in international relations that really spends a lot of time thinking about that. It's more to do with kind of philosophy or medical studies. Those two disciplines tend to write about it. But from my point of view, it really explained a lot of what had happened in Kosovo. I don't want to go on too long about it, but my interest in it stemmed from the fact that when I went there initially to Kosovo, it was just after the Declaration of Independence, and there was an awful lot of hope. There was an awful lot of optimism. People were relieved, obviously, that Kosovo's status had seemingly been clarified, and they were confident that the international community was going to bring them towards the European Union, the United Nations, NATO. There would be peace and prosperity, and everything would be great. And I would go back to Kosovo 3 or 4 times a year after that, and each year the mood darkened, to the point that by around 2015, 2016, almost everybody I spoke to wanted to leave. I was teaching at the American University in Kosovo, and the local students couldn't wait to graduate so they could go to Western Europe. And my friends who were my age, again, I was there often with my kids and my wife, and we were saying how much we loved Kosovo, what a brilliant place it was. And they were kind of saying, I would leave tomorrow if I could, which I thought was, very sad. So the idea of writing a book about hope then stemmed from that. It stemmed from this idea of what happens to a people, what happens to a country if it's promised something and that fails to materialize. When I looked into it, like I said, there wasn't much written about it in international relations, but there was a lot of stuff about it in philosophy and medical studies. And I came across a quote from Alvin Curti in an interview he'd done, I think in 2012. So this was a long time before he became Prime Minister, where he had talked about the people of Kosovo under Serbian rule lived in a prison. And when the Serb army and militia and political system was pushed out of Kosovo, the people of Kosovo moved from a prison to a hospital. And the point he was making about that was that, the people in the hospital the people who run the hospital don't mistreat us. They're not like the Serbs. But they also won't let us leave the hospital. So like the prison, we can't leave. And being confined to a hospital, is problematic, because there is a presumption that you're ill, you're sick, and you can't look after yourself. And that your livelihood, your welfare, your future is dependent on other people looking after you. And Curti's point in 2012, as it had been since 1999, was that Kosovo didn't need to consider itself to be sick, didn't need to consider itself to be so ill that it had to be told what to do every minute of the day by the doctors, by the internationals, by UNMIC or EULEX or whoever it was, that they should exercise their own agency and try to, as he said, break out of the hospital. So, that idea of this particular movement in Kosovo, and it wasn't just a political movement, there was also an artistic movement, some fantastic musicians, playwrights, poets in Kosovo who were kind of working under the radar and writing stuff that was quite subversive and very critical of the internationals. And these were people who were exercising agency in Kosovo in a way that the internationals didn't seem to appreciate or didn't value. So I wanted to write the book about that, about how hopes had been raised, how hopes were dashed. But crucially, and this was, I think, the part of the book that I was most keen for people to kind of pick up on, was that the people of Kosovo didn't just become angry or fall into despair when their hopes were dashed, which is what has happened in many countries in Eastern Europe. They actually channeled their anger in a new direction, into the arts, into culture, but also into this political direction by supporting Vetëvendosje, as opposed to the PDK or the LDK or the AAK and all these other kind of traditional parties. So it was a story about hope that was kind of both a warning, but also, I think, a prescription. This is how to exercise hope well. This is, the people of Kosovo have a lot to teach. The thing that I found frustrating about being in Kosovo for many years, and particularly teaching at the American University in Kosovo, was that because I'm not from Kosovo, when I would speak to the internationals, whether it was American lecturers or foreigners working for EULEX or whatever, things like that, they would talk to me about the locals in a way that they wouldn't talk to the locals. And the kind of things that they would say would, they weren't overtly hostile, but they were tinged with this sense that the locals are lazy, are corrupt, they need help. I remember one guy saying to me, it was like the Stone Age when we arrived in 1999. And there was a presumption that these people cannot exercise their own agency. If it wasn't for us as the kind of heroic West coming to teach the people of Kosovo, they would be still, eating stones. This view infused how the whole world really looked at Kosovo. And I would say the same thing probably about Iraq and Afghanistan and Bosnia and places like that, where the presumption is there's nothing there of any worth and we have to teach them. And their job is to learn from us. And the kind of conclusion to the book was where I was making the point that actually we have a lot to learn from Kosovo.
Mm-hmm.
When you see the election of Donald Trump and when you see Boris Johnson and you see Meloni in Italy or Orban in Hungary or Le Pen in France, that within the West, our people have become angry, but they have channeled that anger in a very destructive way. Whereas in Kosovo, that anger has been channeled in a very constructive way. And so, we have a lot to learn from Kosovo.
So this brings us to the next point. Thank you. What you touched upon now is the idea of good hope versus bad hope, and how in this relationship, it moves from having agency. And you speak about this paternalistic asymmetry. How does this concept of hope then relate to Kosovo's history from the early 1990s to today? And can you give us some insight into the different milestones of hope in Kosovo's political history?
Yeah, once I start talking about Kosovo history, I could be here all day. I don't want to bore people about it and stuff like that. But I think it is fascinating. And it's fascinating because the standard account of what happened in Kosovo tends to be that, there was Yugoslavia, Milosevic rose to power, rescinded Kosovo's autonomy, and then nothing really happened until 1998. And then a civil war broke out, and then NATO intervened and saved the Kosovo Albanians. And that isn't a lie. It's not completely untrue, but it does obscure the extent to which the Kosovo Albanians did exercise agency throughout the period of Yugoslavia, but also particularly in the 1990s. When Milosevic rescinded Kosovo's autonomy in 1989, the people of Kosovo established their own parallel education system, healthcare system, an entire taxation system, and created their own political system from scratch, whilst suffering oppression from a heavily armed authoritarian regime. Now, that was a remarkable achievement to be able to organize in that way. I think, people know about it to an extent, but they don't seem to take it in. They don't seem to really understand what that means. And not only did they do that, they also created their own defense force, the Kosovo Liberation Army. So by the time 1999 came around, they had demonstrated very acute political skills, very acute military skills, organizational skills, and had their own history of exercising agency, whether that was in the early 1980s when you had the political movement to initiate reform that started at the University of Pristina in 1981, and you had the miners' strikes throughout the 80s and things like that, that by the time 1999 came around, the people of Kosovo had demonstrated that they could exercise agency very, very effectively. But that doesn't tend to be the narrative. It tends to be that there was a bad man, Milosevic, who was doing terrible things to these victims. And when the Kosovo Albanians are ever mentioned, they are just hapless victims. And so when the internationals descended on Kosovo in summer of 1999, and I've read a lot of accounts from people who were there, and I've spoken to a lot of people who were involved in UNMIK and NATO at the time as well, and they're all very open about it. The presumption was there isn't a political culture here. There isn't anything that we can build on. We are starting from scratch. We have to therefore adopt this very paternalistic attitude towards the people of Kosovo. So all the history of political agency in Kosovo and the Kosovo Albanians' own capacity to act collectively was discarded. And that did serious damage to the people of Kosovo, but also to the manner in which the internationals ruled Kosovo. And good hope in that context, then, when you read into, I don't believe in my book I added anything to our understanding of hope. I just used what other people had said. So my contribution isn't kind of theoretical, but it was the people who write about what good hope is all make the case that it has to involve obviously a sense that change is possible. You know, you can't exercise hope if you think what you're doing will never work. You know, you can be pessimistic about it. You can think, I want there to be change and I'm going to try to affect change, but I don't think it's actually highly likely to work. And again, you can see that throughout the 1990s in the way the Kosovo Albanians organized themselves, whether it was the kind of Rugova approach or whether it was the KLA's approach, there was an acceptance that we can still possibly overcome these odds. But the other thing about good hope as well is that ability to take guidance, but not to be led all the time, to exercise personal agency, which, you know, happened throughout the 1990s, but then it kind of effectively died when the internationals arrived. So the dominant approach of the Kosovo Albanian elite, the political elite, and civil society and journalists and all these kinds of people, unfortunately, changed from exercising agency to remove Serbian rule to a very passive approach to, now the internationals are here, let's just do whatever they tell us. And that was very debilitating for Kosovo. But even in 1999, there were people who weren't in favor of that approach, but they were a very, very small minority. The majority of people, quite understandably, I think, and I say that in the book as well, felt our job now is just to receive information, to take orders, to implement these orders, and trust that the internationals would guide us towards the promised land. And that isn't good hope. That's bad hope. And it can lead to exploitation. And I talk in the book about how the locals were exploited by the internationals, but also by a very corrupt elite that emerged within Kosovo, and how, you know, that did, again, huge damage to the welfare of the people of Kosovo and Kosovo's status internationally.
One would assume that hope marked its height in Kosovo with independence, with the declaration of independence. First came being freed from the oppressive Milosevic regime, and I think that had an effect in the collective mindset of the people, the war, and then this idea that you're free now, you can do whatever you want. And then up to independence, there was this expectation that something good is happening. But then I think 2008 hit reality that, well, the real work is now. And this is the reality. Kosovo is still in its geographical place where it is. It still faces an antagonized and arrogant and aggressive neighbor, which is Serbia. And if I can say it so, it's under the tutelage of the international community. So how would you interpret hope post 2008, given that you just also mentioned that this was the point of departure in your thought process when writing this book?
Like you said, I feel like the period from 1999 up to 2008, kind of initial optimism and obviously relief that you know, people had survived Milosevic's campaign. NATO had saved the people of Kosovo, and there was also an awful lot of trauma, that people were, you know, wounded literally and you know, emotionally from the absolute nightmare of what happened in 1998 and 1999. So those two things combined led some people to kind of not be as, I suppose, politically engaged as they maybe could have been, quite understandably. But those that were politically engaged, I think, you know, there was a degree of pronounced frustration with the pace of change, that there was a sense that when NATO has come to liberate us, why aren't we now an independent country? Why do we have UNMIC? Why do we have this unresolved status issue? And that's why I think you had the riots in 2004, and you had a lot of disturbances even after that too. I think 2008 was obviously, it is a good thing that Kosovo declared independence from my point of view. But it also, I think, I would argue, it kind of blinded people to the reality of what was coming. There was, again, a sense, I think, that people had that now everything's sorted. The Serbs were removed in 1999. Now in 2008, we're independent. And that's it, we're done. Which just wasn't true. And it wasn't true for kind of two main reasons, really. I think the first is that there still remained an international presence in Kosovo. So you were still under international tutelage to some extent. But the second one, of course, was that just simply declaring independence unilaterally did not make you a recognized member of the international community of states. You know, and I think that the International Court of Justice, its ruling in 2011 that when Serbia took the case to the International Court of Justice to rule on whether it was legal for Kosovo to declare independence, the court found that what Kosovo did wasn't illegal. And I think an awful lot of people misinterpreted that and thought, well, that means that the International Court of Justice has said that we're a legal state, but that's not what they said. And I think that became apparent in the years afterwards. So 2008 for me was, like I said, a good thing that it happened, but it maybe blinded people to the reality. I think if you'd said to people who were celebrating in Pristina or Hejr or Prizren in 2008, February 2008, in January 2025, Kosovo will still not be a member of the European Union, NATO, or the UN, will actually be maybe less of a consolidated state than it is now. People wouldn't have believed it, because there was a sense that the job is done now. I think there was a degree of naivety, and there was also a degree to which the internationals promised things that they couldn't deliver. I make the point in the book as well that in international relations, we tend to talk about, different phases in world politics, and that the phase between after the Cold War ended was one of American dominance, American primacy, what we would call unipolarity, where you only have one dominant power. But that we now live in a world of multipolarity, where there are many big powers who have emerged. America has declined, the West more generally has declined, and you have Russia and China and these other countries becoming more powerful. And most people would say that that period of multipolarity began in 2008, which was obviously when Kosovo declared independence. Multipolarity didn't begin because of Kosovo declaring independence, but it happened at that time. So Kosovo's post-independence life, its emergence as a state into the world in 2008, happened at a particular time when its key allies began to become less powerful. And that had a huge impact, obviously, on what has happened to Kosovo since then. It was a kind of the wrong time to be born in some respects, if you want to kind of think of it like that. But Kosovo has survived. It is still there, thankfully.
You speak of the wrong time to be born, and I think post-2008, then moving forward to 2014, despite the expectations of the better day, to use this language, we have seen, as you mentioned, young people leaving Kosovo massively, seeking a better life, mostly in Germany. Do you, or would you interpret this as a defiance of hope, as it means they're performing some form of agency?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally when your hopes are dashed, you respond with either one of two emotions, and they're anger or despair. And I think you could see the despair very evident in Kosovo in the fact that domestically people had kind of given up on politics. There's so many examples I could give where, when I was in Kosovo, people said things to us about the political system and said they'd given up on it. And I remember taking my kids horse riding one time and some farm outside Pristina, and it was all wonderfully sort of basic and crude. It wasn't a ranch or anything like that. It was just a guy who had horses and he allowed us to use them and go around the field. But I remember him putting one of my kids on the horse, and he pointed at the horse and said, "That horse has got more sense than any politician in Kosovo." It was just things like that highlighted it. But more clear evidence was the fact that, as you said, people were leaving in such massive numbers. And that really was an extraordinary exodus of people. I think it was the end of 2015 was the worst period, where everybody seemed to be leaving. Now that's despair. That's despair in action. That's people saying, there's nothing for me here. I have to leave. I got so used to talking to people who were working as waiters or whatever, and they would say that they have a degree in medicine and they're just saving up enough money to go to, like you said, Germany. And lots of my friends that had, been, around my age, so had lived through the horrors of the 1990s, wanted to build a strong, stable Kosovo and work there. By 2014, 2015, I just had enough, and they wanted to leave. And there you go, that's despair. That's what happens when you raise hopes and they're dashed. I really felt at that time, 2015, 2016, that it was going to end very, very badly. The whole thing was just going to become a catastrophe. It was going to be, as I said, I'm from Ireland. The 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, even the 80s in Ireland, for many decades, young people, as soon as they could, just left Ireland. And the west coast of Ireland has never recovered from that, because all the villages, all the towns, all the young people left, and you just had old men and women slowly dying in these towns and villages, and the life was sucked out of them. I could see the same thing happening to Kosovo. It looked to me that, that was going to happen. All the young people were going to leave, and you're just going to be left with the old people, which isn't the basis for any kind of society. So if you'd asked me in 2016, how do I think the future of Kosovo will be and what's the likelihood, I would have said it will go badly, badly wrong. I wrote an article around that time where I talked about Kosovo being a failed state, that it had all the characteristics of a failed state. I made the point then, and I still hold to it now, that that doesn't mean that the people of Kosovo were the problem. They hadn't created a failed state, that the internationals and this corrupt elite in Kosovo had created these conditions where, why would you stay in Kosovo if you can't get a job? Why would you stay in Kosovo if, your child is sick and you bring them to the hospital and it's completely underfunded? The infrastructure in Kosovo, the road systems, the healthcare system, the education system, everything was just a disaster. And you add to that the fact that Kosovo's status is not clear. Well, why would you stay? It would have made perfect sense to leave. And I couldn't see that there was any solution to that. And that could have been Kosovo's future. And it looked like it was going to become one of those kinds of places, but it didn't. It didn't, thankfully, because a new attitude, I think, emerged in Kosovo, led people to exercise agency in a way that other countries in Europe didn't. And they began to support a new political movement, support new cultural movements, support more independent media, genuinely independent civil society organizations. And this began to gather momentum and catalyze genuine change. So, the 2017 election, when Vetvindozi became for the first time the largest single party in the assembly, that was a really important turning point. They didn't get into power in 2017, but it certainly sent a message that they are now the biggest single party. And it was at that point that me and people like me, I guess, started to think, if this continues, there is some hope. There is some chance that this could turn around.
Just to stay within the election of Vetvindozi, particularly in 2020, how did Kurti change the political mindset in Kosovo? And how much did he change his politics to become prime minister?
I think it would be for any political figure, if you think the same things when you're 40 that you thought when you were 20, I think it's a bad sign. I don't think that's a sign of consistency. I think that's just stubborn. Everyone has seen the pictures of Albin Kurti with dreadlocks and in the 1990s. He's not the same guy, clearly. And the guy that was arrested in 2007 for direct action against UNMIK and stuff like that, he's clearly not the same guy. And I don't think he would have been elected if he was running around with a can of spray paint and facing EULEX vehicles in 2017. He has a suit now and he's well turned out and all those kinds of things. And I think, like I said, that you have to make some kind of cosmetic changes possibly to become leader, but I think you also have to be a bit more pragmatic. But I don't think that he or the party have changed radically. I defy anybody to say that the party today is a corrupt party. That's one thing that they always campaigned against. And since they were elected in 2020, I think you can say that they haven't changed their ways in that respect. Now, obviously, as the party grew, brought in new members who maybe weren't as sort of ideologically pure as the people who started the Kosovo Action Network in 1997 or whatever. And some people in the party have been accused of and even found guilty of engaging in corruption. But I think that's at an individual level. It's not systemic like it was with the PDK and the LDK. I mean, in 2017, 2018, the World Bank described Kosovo as an example of state capture. It was a captured state. It wasn't that there was one or two individuals in Kosovo who were corrupting. The entire political system effectively was corrupt. Now, that just isn't the case today. So I think, they came to power but by virtue of being able to demonstrate that they were committed to Kosovo rather than committed to making themselves, powerful, whether that's economically powerful or politically powerful, that they were people who were engaged in politics for the right reasons. And they didn't emerge overnight. And I think that's the thing that I say in the book too, that's quite important. There's been many parties in Europe that have suddenly emerged and become hugely popular because people are just casting around for some alternative to the mainstream parties. And suddenly you have a political party that says, we're going to change everything, we're going to make everything a better place, and everyone votes for them. And actually they're very superficial. But that party, Kurti in particular, and the core group of activists around him have been active in Kosovo since, the 1990s. And people know that and trust him for that. I'm not a member of the party, and I don't agree with every single policy they have. I think that they demonstrated a commitment to justice and tackling corruption and to putting Kosovo first that the other political parties simply didn't have. And people recognize that. People voted for them in huge numbers in 2017, voted for them in huge numbers in 2020, and did so again in 2022. And I don't think the people of Kosovo can be accused of being stupid. They recognize that these are people who are the only ones who are capable of standing up for Kosovo's interests. And I think that was pretty clear. I think that is something that people need to recognize too, is that the problems that the current government face, particularly with respect to that, the ASM, the Association of Serb Majority Municipalities, that problem and so many other problems that the current government faces, it didn't create. These were problems that were created by the LDK and the PDK. It was them that signed the agreement to create the ASM. It was them that signed the agreement to create the special court. It was them that, entered into negotiations with Serbia, without ever talking about the missing, the crimes that Serbia committed in the 1990s, the Kosovo status. They allowed a political negotiations to develop where Kosovo was basically being treated like a kind of a sick child in the corner, and the proper big men, Vucic and the European Union, were discussing what to do about this problematic person who's consigned to the periphery. And that was a disgrace, and Kosovo should never have allowed that to happen. And Kurti has put an end to it. And Kurti has put an end to the bizarre situation whereby you had a parallel system operating inside Kosovo. People who were not engaged with the Kosovo political system or the economic system in any way, shape, or form. A movement inside Kosovo, within the Kosovo Serb community. And again, just to reiterate, not every Kosovo Serb is part of that movement, but there is a violent movement there that is seeking to create a new conflict. Now, this is the reality that Kurti has faced, and I think he's handled it extremely well.
Towards the end of your book, you write about anger being instrumentalized to influence change in Kosovo. And you connote your argument also with the election of Albin Kurti and Vedran Rusje. Clearly, I foresee that Kurti will have another mandate, and the pressure will be paramount on him to agree on some form of compromise with the international community. How do you think, clearly we don't know, but how do you think will this play out, and how will this influence Kosovo politics? How compromising perhaps will Kurti will have to be, considering the pressure?
Yeah, I imagine that he will come under considerable pressure again, like he did under the Biden administration. I gave a talk at the University of Pristina towards the end of December, and a lot of people asked me that question, and I kind of tried to address it in my talk as well. But if somebody says to Kosovo, if you compromise in this area, you will get these benefits. You will get some return for your compromise. That's what a compromise is, where you give something away, but you get something back in return. And I've never heard Kurti say, I will never compromise about anything. The point that he has made is that I will compromise, but a compromise means I must get something in return. If you look at what the American embassy in Pristina or US ambassadors and all these other people have been saying for the past 4 or 5 years, not just the US, but other people as well, they've been pressing Kosovo to compromise, but they're not actually asking Kosovo to compromise. They're asking Kosovo to capitulate And there's a big difference. Giving in is not the same as compromising. I think Curti has made the point many, many times that we will implement certain measures that we don't want to implement if we get something in return for that. And the things that he's asking are elementary things. The recognition of Kosovo's internal and external sovereignty. There isn't a self-respecting state in the world that wouldn't want that. Well, we don't want to create the ASM if we're not going to get anything in return for that. We don't want to create an ASM that's actually going to fundamentally undermine Kosovo's territorial integrity. We don't want to have a land swap agreement. We don't want to create some kind of mechanism whereby we agree to some nebulous EU word jumble that will allow Serbia to join the European Union, but keep us out of the European Union. That would be patently ridiculous. Albin Kurti's life would be much easier if he had just capitulated, and he would have been brought to the White House and everyone would have said, look at him, he's wonderful, we all love Albin Kurti, and he would have been given a medal by Joe Biden and all of that would have been great. But, when the Washington Agreement was signed, let's say, by Hoti, when he took over from Kurti, that agreement, you have Trump and you have Grenell, and they're all saying, oh, look, the Kosovo prime minister is wonderful. He's a man of peace and we think he's great and all that. And he gets lauded as a good guy and gets lots of accolades. But what good came from that for Kosovo? Zero. Nothing. Nothing good came from that agreement. You had Israel recognizing Kosovo. Okay, maybe that's one more recognition. Does it make a difference in practice to Kosovo's status internationally? I don't think so. I don't think anything good came from that agreement for Kosovo. So simply signing an agreement, it might give you short-term acclaim, might make you somebody that the international press and the international community champions as a great statesman and a man of peace. But, Kurti is not thinking about himself. He's thinking about Kosovo, as far as I know. And I'm not close to the man and I don't have any kind of insight into his character or anything like that. But that's what I would read from it, that he is doing what he's doing for the benefit of Kosovo. And he's taking an awful lot of abuse for it. But the alternative, the way the international system is going, is that Kosovo is being pushed into the wastelands. And if Kosovo went back to the PDK and the LDK and those old traditional parties, they would sign anything. They'll agree to anything. Because in return, the international community was saying, if you guys want to go back to capturing Kosovo again and just running the country into deprivation and poverty, and you guys get wealthy while the rest of the countries, and we'll turn a blind eye to it. And that's what you'll get in return. You give up Kosovo's sovereignty and we'll let you run this little place in the middle of nowhere that nobody cares about, and you can just become a kind of a state capture again. That's the alternative. That's the way things are going. And what Kosovo has to do, and what the government of Kosovo has to do in the coming years, is hold firm. Is hold firm to the ideals and the basic principles that we want to be independent and we want to be free. And that brings with it challenges. And Kosovo, like a number of small states around the world, has to make very difficult decisions in the coming years. And one guaranteed way to cast Kosovo into the oblivion is to simply agree to everything that the international community asks it to do. Because the international community today, they are not the same people who intervened in Kosovo in 1999 or supported Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008. It's a completely different set of actors, not just literally in terms of the people, in terms of the outlook that America has, that France has, that Germany has, that the UK has, that Italy has. They have a completely different set of priorities, and their priority is not to support Kosovo anymore. Their number one priority when it comes to the Western Balkans is to support Serbia, is to appease Serbia. And that's dreadful for Serbia because it allows this authoritarian, violent, sectarian leader, Vučić, and his cronies to come to power and capture Serbia and engage in corruption, engage in violence and mafia, make it a mafia state. That's terrible for Serbia. It's also terrible for Kosovo because it means that Kosovo is being asked to give up all these principles relating to sovereignty and independence and democracy, not for its own good, but for the benefit of Serbia. The point is to try to bring Serbia closer to the West, to keep it away from Russia. And if that means casting Kosovo into the wilderness, so be it. The people of Kosovo have to be realistic about that. And I know that that's very difficult, to accept because understandably the West, and America in particular, are seen as heroic figures that saved us in 1999, that enabled us to declare independence in 2008. And it's very difficult to accept that the person that you love and that, saved you, now no longer loves you, now no longer has your interests at stake. And it's a very bitter pill to swallow, but people have to be realistic about that.
Hearing you speak, one can recognize how beyond your research you have become close to Kosovo and the Kosovo people. Something that I also mentioned depicts well in your research. You try to see it from the agency of the locals, from the perspective of what it means for someone who is there, and this changes and the political scene affects them. And this brings us to the last question of this conversation. Clearly, going back to Kosovo, very often you also develop friendships, I can imagine, and familiarity and depth. So my question for this discussion at the end would be, if there is one thing that you could bring from Kosovo to the UK, what would it be?
I mean, I'll answer it kind of in an abstract way first, and maybe I'll then say something more kind of definite. But the thing that I love most about Kosovo is the energy of the people. I'm not misty-eyed about it. I know there's a lot of people in Kosovo that I don't particularly like and who aren't full of energy, and I don't get on with. But the people that I do like, and the people that I've come to know and work with in many different areas, are people who demonstrate a real love of life and an energetic approach to life. So, that would be people, journalists, particularly a lot of the people that work for Kosovo 2.0, the work ethic that they have and their commitment to, genuine, investigative journalism. There's so many wonderful journalists that work for Kosovo 2.0 and lots of other publications in Kosovo, but also I've been to the Kosovo Theatre Showcase a number of times as well, and you meet Yeton from Kendra Multimedia and the incredible work that he does there and the energy that he has, and Blurte, his wife, who's, similarly inspiring person to be around. Lots of the independent arts cafes and museums and exhibition centers in Kosovo as well, that again are just people who are full of energy, enthusiasm, a love for life, a love for culture, and a love for kind of a subversive view of the world. And the political actors that I meet as well, who I'm always in awe of the fact that most people I know in Kosovo have 3 or 4 jobs. They're politicians, they're lawyers, they're also something else. And that is amazing. And living in the UK at the moment, where everybody is so jaded, everybody is so cynical, everybody is so bored of politics, everybody's so bored of life and culture and stuff like that, we have little pockets of vitality in the UK. And, my wife and I happen to be involved in a number of cultural things that aren't jaded, but as a culture, the UK is in decline, it's on the way down, whereas the energy in Kosovo, I would love to bring that back to the UK if I could. But more practically, what I would bring back if I had to would be flea, the food, I went to.
Oh yes, I love that.
Yeah, I went to Kosovo last year with my MA students, and I told them beforehand, just make sure you try some flea, make sure you try some burek, make sure you try some of the wonderful food that you get in Kosovo. They did, and they loved Kosovo, and they came back, but I remember eating it with them, the flea one time, and they looked at me kind of like, is this the thing you were talking about that's so delicious? And I was going, yeah, do you not think so? And they're going, not really. But I love it, absolutely love it. And, if I could bring back a huge portion of that, then I would, So yeah, the food, the Ivar as well, obviously, that would be the thing I would bring back, which I do. Every time I come back, I bring back a jar of Ivar and try and smuggle as much of the fleet as I can as well.
Yes, I think that's our story, diaspora story, smuggle food from Kosovo.
Yeah.
But that is a beautiful ending to this conversation. And thank you for sharing your thoughts and research with the audience of Diaspora Speaking.
Thank you, Rina. Yeah, no, it's been a real honor to talk to you. Cheers.